This lecture is involving the interpreting of legal descriptions. Now later we will get into preparing legal descriptions, but for the upcoming material on research and predetermined analysis, we need to understand what a legal description is and what we're looking at. So, the purpose of a legal description is a great place to start. Black's Law Dictionary, which you'll find is a national standard of what a legal term should be understood to mean, calls it a written description of real property by metes and bounds or lot numbers of a recorded plat, ... Such must be complete enough that a particular parcel of land can be located and identified. So, the purpose of a legal description in the present era is really no different than it has ever been. The purpose is to adequately and fully describe a particular parcel of land with such sufficiency that there's no question as to where the boundaries are. Now, if you've ever done any field surveying, you may laugh and say there are often plenty of instances of uncertainties, and that is true. This is dealing with the theory of a legal description, where things theoretically should be located. We will eventually study resolving issues and discrepancies and variations and conflicting elements, but in theory, a legal description is complete, and it controls the boundary and establishes usually the vesting title to the property that we're surveying, if we're referring to the legal description in the vesting deed, which is then called the vesting description. There are a lot of different styles and formats and preferences and ways that people like to see them written. When I say people, I mean primarily attorneys and those who are involved in the legal profession, be it paralegals, insurance, title insurance agents, or underwriters, etc. So the last sentence bears a little mention that although certain imperfections can invalidate a legal description, and perhaps even a transaction or a sales contract, a mere inaccuracy in a description will not in itself void it. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be pretty close. Again, this lecture is on analyzing and interpreting legal descriptions, not preparing them. What are some essential elements of a legal description? A legal description, regardless of which format, should include a local caption. Basically gives you an idea of where it is. This is usually starting from larger to smaller. State, county, if it's within a city, it's within a city. Then is Georgia Militia District a proper citation? That might be next. If it's in the land lot area, then the district and section, or the land lot and district, and then the section if it's in the original Cherokee County. Next, you would have the actual description of the property, which we will dive into momentarily, and then a reference to any survey or plat if known. This would be basically in the footnotes, along with the area, either in acreage or square feet, and any conditions such as less than except or subject to. Georgia law in 44-533 says that no prescribed form is essential to the validity of a deed to lands or personalty. If the deed is sufficient in itself to make known the transaction between the parties, no want of form will invalidate it. This basically means that if the description can be used to adequately locate property, it's legal. It also means that there is no definite required form. You don't have to word things in an exact certain way. It just has to adequately describe. Now, there are different types of legal descriptions. I've identified 5 that I have saw in my career. Some legal books and even surveying textbooks and title insurance company handbooks, which are great sources of information, they will list 3. And those 3 are the metes and bound, and the plat reference. I've also added the bounded by because we do see this in rural areas in the colonial states. and an omnibus, which is rare, but you need to know that it's there. So a meets only description is rarely created in modern practice. That would be comprised solely of measurements, meets being an old British word for measure, or possibly Gaelic, but it comes from our English ancestry. That in itself is something that you do see, especially if you see engineers or non-surveyors crank out a legal description. It's just simply measurements. One thing that I would point out is that to a lot of engineers, surveying is just measuring, and measuring is easy. This course concentrates on the legal aspects of surveying, which means that we're doing a lot more than measuring. We'll come back to that. So a meets description is kind of rare, but they do exist. You do see them, and we'll talk about them. Bounded by, or simply bounded, or bounds description. This is the simplest, and it can be unambiguous, but it can also be problematic, especially for title insurers. And a bounded description would simply be bounded on the north by Smith, bounded on the west by the highway, bounded on the south by Williams Creek, and bounded on the east by the Norwood property. So it's not giving a descriptive tract by tract or line by line description. It's just saying it's that piece of property which is bounded by these following bounds. And so what makes it problematic is that you're at the mercy of where Smith and Norwood think their boundaries are. In actual application, if you're retracing a bounds description, the recorded or vesting title description for those adjacent properties are what control your boundaries, because that's what's essentially called for. Meets and bounds is what you'll see the most. It is the by far the most common use in the colonial states and for developed properties nationwide. As the name suggests, it's a blend of meets and bounds. And we'll talk more about meets and bounds descriptions shortly. There is what I call the plat reference description, to where reference to a recorded plat is made by simply saying it's lot number 5 in the Smith subdivision, recorded in Plat Book 5, page 88 of Jenkins County, Georgia. That would be a very simplistic plat reference survey, or legal description. Calls for a survey. You may also see this referred to as a lot and block. So that's a term that's been assigned to it, because in a lot of urban subdivisions, especially 100 years ago, instead of having a name like Winfield or Gulliford Downs, it would simply be John Doe subdivision, and each little section would be a different block. So it might be lot 7 of block B of John Doe subdivision. Now, the omnibus subdivision is rare, but it's basically just like an omnibus spending bill in Congress. It's supposed to carry a lot. It's a big old bus that you put a lot of stuff on. You can actually look up the word omnibus and get a better feel, but what it would basically be used for is if ABC Developers buys up 15 or 20 pieces of property, they put it all together, they start selling off tracks to Walmart, movie theater, racetrack, Zaxby's, and at the end, they're done. They're about to shut down the LLC. Some of the parties have passed away. It's been a few years since they've had any business, and they may convey to a trustee, a bank, an attorney, one of the landowners in the assemblage like Walmart or Kroger, the description that basically says whatever's left. You know, if there is anything left, any remaining interest that the grantor has of any property in a certain location is hereby granted. That basically means if you find out later that they forgot to sign a right-of-way deed and the county's wanting a right-of-way deed so they can get funding, the person that receives the omnibus deed will have whatever interest they had. It's basically a form of a quitclaim deed. It could also be where there's, I saw one of these recently down on the coast in Georgia, to where certain man had acquired around 45 parcels of land in 4 different Georgia militia districts on both sides of a big highway, and all joined in several different creeks. And over the time span from just after World War II, when he started acquiring property, to sometime in the mid-80s when he passed, he sold a lot of that off, deeded it to people to build a house on, deeded some of it to kids, and all of the boundaries did not exactly match up. Didn't use the surveys for all of it, didn't use the same surveyor for what did get surveyed. And so this omnibus description was to one of his heirs, basically said anything that's left in McIntosh County, Georgia, that John Doe owned at the time of his death is hereby granted to Margaret Doe Smith. Moving on. So what we're going to study on now is interpreting a metes and bounds description. Now, there are a lot of there's some different stylistic differences. You can read several of them, and you can tell that there are just a few differences in how they do things. Some people use the degree symbol. Some spell out the word degree. Some like to say proceeding. Some just say thence. Some may say nothing at all. Going back to that state law quotation, if it's adequate, and it doesn't really matter what form you use. A metes and bounds description is supposed to be giving someone, usually a retracing surveyor, but really anybody, property owner, neighbor, realtor, etc., some exact directions on how to get to and get around a piece of property. Call it a journey, like a road trip, just a lot smaller, but a lot more detailed. So every metes and bounds description must have a valid point of beginning. Failing to do so does not necessarily invalidate the description, but at a minimum it puts the retracing surveyor on notice that extra work will have to be done to confirm the property's location. This is important. This is one of those clouds. This is one of the ambiguities that if we have an ambiguous or inadequate point of beginning, we're probably going to have to qualify our survey as needing some other sort of confirmation. It might need a corrective deed. It might need a quitclaim deed from a previous owner. It might need an affidavit by the surveyor that says, I have confirmed this is the same property because of ABC. And that might be where we have to use other calls and other features in the description to determine that we're in the right place in spite of an inadequate point of beginning. So having an inadequate or ambiguous point of beginning can cause all kinds of title insurance problems and legal problems and property disputes. Just imagine if from a certain point, say a point of intersection, you're supposed to go 500 feet. And instead they said 50 feet. They just fat fingered and failed to put in a 0. Your property is described as being 450 feet, totally different than where it was. Also imagine that you have a right-of-way intersection of 2 roads to be used as a point of beginning or a point of commencement. And near it, say 50 feet away, one of those roads intersects a railroad right-of-way. And the plat is drawn and depicted as coming from the railroad intersection, but the legal description says that it's coming from the road intersection. Basically, now you have a 50-foot ambiguity as to where the property actually, where that bearing and distance actually comes from. Does it come from where it's shown on the plat, or does it come from where it's called for in the deed? It's 2 totally different locations. I was recently involved in a really high stakes property dispute in DeKalb County where that is the essence of the entire multi-million-dollar lawsuit over the validity of a legal description. And that and a contractual legal element were the 2 things that won the case at hearing without having to be deliberated further. So this is important to make sure that the point of beginning and point of commencement is in there correctly. So the point of beginning is a point on the property's boundary. Now, I'm going to teach the way that I practice and that I do legal descriptions. You'll see, I'm going to touch on some of the other styles so that you'll know what you're getting, but know that this is what I consider and what the legal community in Georgia considers to be the proper way of addressing point of beginning, point of commencement, true point of beginning. These are all terms you'll run across. So the point of beginning is a point on the property's boundary where the courses around it begin from. It should be a fixed position that can be easily found or reestablished or referenced to one. If the fixed point of beginning is not on the property boundary, then it's called the point of commencement. In other words, to get to the property described, you start at the point of commencement, that's where you commence, and then go to the property that's being described with courses. So then the courses around the subject property will follow. Confusing use of the term true point of beginning. So some scriveners, and scrivener being someone who scribes or writes, a legal clerk, an attorney, or even a surveyor, whoever is writing something is the scrivener. That's a legal term that you will run across. Some scriveners have called the point of commencement the point of beginning. And then when they get to the point of beginning, they call it the true point of beginning. So it's relatively easy to interpret and follow, but it opens the door for confusion. So in essence, the legal description is calling for two different points of beginning. The first one is the actual point of commencement, where the whole description starts. And then the second one is where the actual subject property being described starts, which they would refer to as a true point of beginning. I'll comically say that one might wonder if there is a false point of beginning, since there is a true one. So, legal description is a journey. Once the point of beginning has been established, the courses, or calls, or bearings and distances, will direct the reader around the property with the precision of the description. In other words, if it says 100 yards more or less, that's as precise as you can follow it. Corner monuments and monuments found along the line should be cited and described, but they're not always. Essentially, the legal description is supposed to serve the same purpose as the plat. It's just in a written format instead of a mapping format. The typical metes and bounds description is usually drafted from a plat. Sometimes they reference it, which is nice, sometimes they don't. So conversely, someone should be able to convert a legal description back to a mapping format. This is similar to translating a saying from one language to another and then later having it translated back into the native language. You can sometimes get a little bit different version than you started, just like when you tell a story or tell a rumor around a room full of people. It'll change a little bit, but it shouldn't. Hopefully it's close enough to the same to be used. But converting a written legal description to something in mapping or graphic format is a necessary skill set for a retracing land surveyor. You might ask why. Well, we don't always have a plat to go by. I've surveyed many tracts of land where the subject property, as well as the adjoining properties, all of the recorded descriptions were just deeds with metes and bounds descriptions. And this becomes problematic. Not really. Sometimes there's detail that's lost from not having the surveys, but we can convert those written legal descriptions to something that serves the purpose of a plat to go out and survey by. Talking about some common terms, this is in the handout. I'm not going to go over all of them, but these are common terms that you'll run across. The ones that I'll point out as an original line or a landlot line is obviously referring to an original landlot line in a landlot area of the state. One thing that's to point out is a lot of legal descriptions say I've got 10 acres and I've got a long legal description that describes it, but I've sold 2 acres off to my neighbor. Well, if I've never had a new survey of the 8 acres that remains, or I don't have a description of just those 8 acres, my description will be the same that I bought by of that whole 10 acres. And then down below it's going to say, less and except 2 acres sold to Bill Smith as described as follows, blah, blah, blah. So that leaves a net conveyance or description of 8 acres. Here is an example. I randomly pulled this today from public records in an area that I had just ran across some pretty good metes and bounds descriptions. So up here's the caption. All that tract or parcel of land lying and being in And that's pretty well universal. That should be the opening sentence of every caption of every legal description you'll run across in any state, basically. Being in Land Lot 6 in the 5th District and 4th Section of Chattooga County, Georgia, being more particularly described as follows. So right here's our caption. It tells us that we're in the state of Georgia. Further dialing it down, we're in Chattooga County. Further dialing down, we're within the 4th section, which is 27 miles and change wide over the Alabama border. We're in the 5th district of that section. And to dial it down even more, we're in Land Lot 6 of that district. So all of a sudden, these top two lines tell us that we're within a half-mile square that is unique in the whole state of Georgia. Nowhere else in the state of Georgia is in Land Lot 6 of the 5th District, 4th Section in Chattooga County. So you'll see that in public land survey states, it's similar. You start off with the smaller unit and go to the bigger. Here's the beginning point. Beginning at an iron pin at the intersection of the south line of Land Lot 6 with the west right-of-way of Lick Skillet Road. Okay, that's where two known features, a landlot line and a public road, intersect. They don't tell us how wide the right-of-way is, but wherever that right-of-way is, that's where we should find this iron pin. That's a beginning point. Fence north 89, 0044 west, 367.50 feet to a point. Now I'm kind of saddened that it don't say to a 2-inch open pipe at a fence corner. But whoever wrote this either didn't have the information or didn't really care to give us the information. All we know is that it's a point. Maybe a pin, maybe nothing at all. Fence north 41 degrees 02 minutes 38 seconds east, 670.56 feet to another pesky point. Fence south 53 degrees, no minutes, no seconds east, 100 feet to a point. Fence north 82 31 10 east, 300 feet to a point on the west right-of-way of Lick Skillet Road. So now we have another feature. We've really been pretty much just meets, just varying a distance to a point to a point. Don't know if we're going along somebody's property line, fence, creek. We just have strictly meets in that area. But now we're bounded by Lick Skillet Road, so we're meets and bounds again. We don't really look at when we flip a switch from meets to meets and bounds, but sometimes you have to mentally think about, which is which, what are we doing here? Fence following the west right-of-way of Lick Skillet Road, the following courses and distances. I won't go through them, blah, 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 to the point of beginning. So here, the beginning point, there is no commencing point off-site. The beginning point is an on point where the landlot line and the right-of-way intersect. And then we have a journey, mathematically described, back to the point of beginning. And the footnote containing 5 acres, according to a survey by Associated Surveyors, Inc., dated March 11th, 1993, revised March 12th, 1993. Would be really nice if it was recorded and we had the plat book and page where we would go look at it, but we can't have our cake and eat it too. So, let's say we're either retracing this property, our client has hired us to survey this property, or perhaps this is an adjacent piece of property. Either way, we have to interpret the legal description and decide what we're looking at and what we expect to find in the course of our research and analysis, which we will get to in a subsequent lecture and module. So you can take these bearings and distances, you can take a CAD program, and here is what those look like. You begin right here, there's the bearing and distance first one, to dot, out here to the right of way of the road, ba-doom, 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 and it closes within 1/10 of a foot, which is really nice. That means we didn't fat finger anything. So here's one way that you can convert this written legal description that we just looked at to a mapping product that you as a surveyor can go, oh, okay, and you could go survey it. Now, often you either don't have the opportunity to build it in a surveying or CAD platform. That doesn't mean that we're hampered. So looky here, I did this hand drawn. It's not to scale. It's just generally in the directions. And I have transcribed everything in the property or in the description onto this hand drawn hand plot. Now the point of beginning is an iron pin. It's at the intersection of the west right-of-way of Lick Skillet Road and the south line of Land Lot 6. Poof, there's where we begin. Then here's these same bearings and distances. Poof, we come back to the west right-of-way of Lick Skillet Road, and here are the calls down the road back to the point of beginning. Now you'll notice, because I was just doing this by, in my mind, what's a South 53 East? That's really more like 44 maybe. I said North 82 East, that's probably more like 75 or so. But I'm just trying to be relevant, just a proportional scale, so that if I, especially in the old days, you go to the courthouse and get all this stuff on the way to the job to go survey it. So you don't have time to sit down and key everything in a desktop computer and plot it off. Now, even if you don't have a desktop computer, you can still key it into a tablet or data collector and have a mapping image virtually prepared and on your screen. But historically, this is something that we would have done on the way to the job, or once we got there, or before we left the courthouse, if we didn't have time to go back to the office and plot it out precisely. But even then, if we're just surveying, just say that we're surveying south of Joyner, all we need to know really, all that we really need at that point is this part of the description. So we might not have done the rest of this. We might have just said, oh, we're beginning an iron pin, we're going 367.5. Okay, well, we need to look right in here for a Joyner pin.